This is a border, a legal frontier dividing two states, Russia and Finland. Like most frontiers, this one is man-made. It doesn't pay much attention to geography. It's the result of politics, the politics of war and Cold War.
381. Martin. Kiitos.
Here in Eastern Europe, clear geographic markers for frontiers are rare. That's one of the reasons why people have for so long been unsure where the idea of Europe ought to end in the East. Geography is very important in defining ourselves, the limits we set to our civilization. One way our ancestors learned to see themselves as Europeans, different from peoples of other civilizations, was by sensing that they occupied a particular space.
And here in the west of Europe, it was quite easy to define that space. After the Moors had been expelled from Spain, then really the sea did it. From Norway right round the western Mediterranean, Europe and the offshore islands were girdled by water. The names still say what that meant. That's a part of France over there, Finistère, a word derived from the old Latin phrase, Finisterrae, the end of the world, or if you prefer it, Land's End, to use another familiar name. But in the East, it was much harder to say where Europe should be thought to end. There, geography mattered much less often than the facts of history or culture. Facts like, for example, the long, centuries-long domination by the Turks, an alien Islamic power, of much of the Danube Valley and the Balkans. And further north, too, where the great northern plains of Europe rolled eastward for hundreds of miles, seemingly endlessly, there was another great historical fact, Russia. Russia's long been an enigma. Is she or is she not to be considered a part of Europe, a sharer in Western civilization, or is she something alien? Where, in fact, do you draw the line bounding Western civilization in the east of Europe? These are not new questions. They've been asked for a very long time. It would be very silly to try to answer them simply in the context of the politics and ideology of our own day. The roots of answers have to be sought very deep indeed. We have to go back, in fact, a long way into history for them.
We have to go back 1,500 years or so, to a time when Finland and Russia never existed, when Eastern Europe was inconceivably different, to the city founded by the Emperor Constantine on the Bosphorus. In the west, the Roman Empire had crumbled away, but its heritage had passed to the Christian Empire of the East, whose capital was here, Byzantium. Ever since the 3rd century, when, for easier administration, the Roman Empire had been divided in two, its center of gravity had shifted eastwards. That set the tide towards a Greek-speaking empire, centered on Constantinople, solidly based in Anatolia and southeast Europe, but stretching deep into Asia and Africa. The Byzantine Empire was a fortress, a shield. Its military power held off not just the barbarians north and east of the Danube, but the power of Persia too. In time, it would have to face the onslaught of Islam. That Byzantine power long provides us with a marker for the extent of Christendom in the East. The empire sheltered many peoples: Syrians, Armenians, Georgians, Jews, Cretans, Egyptians, Arabs, many others. The peasants supplied its manpower and its taxpayers. And there were great cities, too, trading centers whose varied influences were added to the cultural heritage of Greece and Rome. The heart of Byzantine civilization was religion. It was a force suffusing everything: politics, government, art, literature. The empire was shot through with theological significance. It was there to serve the purposes of God. It was a machine for getting people to heaven. The man who ran that machine was the emperor. And in the middle of the 6th century, the imperial throne was occupied by perhaps the greatest of all Byzantine emperors. He was called Justinian. Justinian won back Roman Italy from the barbarians and once again briefly established an imperial capital here at Ravenna, where the mosaics in San Vitale now commemorate him and his court. Justinian seems to have been thoroughly unpleasant, deceptive, mean, suspicious, ungrateful. But he was also ambitious and behaved as an emperor was expected to behave, vigorously and despotically. Under him, the Byzantine autocracy matured into a system of power which was for centuries to shape the future of Eastern Europe.
This was the place where Constantine founded his second Rome, Constantinople, Istanbul as it is today. It was built on the site of an ancient Greek city, Byzantium, which is how the Byzantine Empire got its name. And it was here, too, that the Emperor Justinian demonstrated and established the Byzantine theory of Christian monarchy, that secular and spiritual power were essentially one. It was a theory that didn't have much luck in the West, but thanks to Justinian and his successors, it triumphed here in the East. Like the old Rome, Constantinople was built on 7 hills. On this one, which was the site of the old Acropolis of the Greek town, Justinian built this great church. Since the fire, Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom.
Hagia Sophia was built like a theatre to accommodate the great imperial ceremonies. It was to be a model for future churches, and one day, ironically, for future Islamic mosques. Into it, the wealth of the empire was poured. Gold, glass, marble, 20 tons of silver alone brought from far away. 10,000 men were mobilized to build it. Justinian, they say, went to the site almost daily during the 5 years building. In 537 it was dedicated, and on that day, Justinian, remembering another great builder, burst out with pride, "Glory be to God, who has thought me worthy of so great a work. O Solomon, I have surpassed thee." For centuries, the incense and the chanting rose, and the rituals of the Greek church interwove the drum of the faith with that of the empire. That Orthodox faith, like the empire itself, evolved with time. Rooted in a different soil from that which nurtured the Roman Catholicism of the West, it diverged more and more from it as the centuries passed. And so a gulf of cultural difference widened between the two halves of Christendom. And at times, it deepened into schism. But Orthodoxy is more than just a doctrinal version of Christianity. It also embodies a certain view of authority. After Justinian, Byzantine emperors were in a way the living embodiments of a particular political idea, the idea that spiritual and secular authority were not separable, but the same, that they were indivisible, located in the same person. And that meant that those Eastern emperors had a very special kind of authority. They were autocrats, sole and supreme rulers. They combined the role of prince and priest, perhaps
in a way that they'd learnt from emperors further east in Persia rather than from the emperors of ancient Rome.
Early Christian emperors were usually canonized by the Church. Maybe one can see older traditions at work there. The pagan Roman emperors, after all, had been deified. Certainly other exotic influences came to bear as the grandeur of the emperor's authority grew. Byzantine monarchs came to receive ritual prostrations, kowtows, as it were, like Oriental rulers. And the heads which look down from the mosaics are surrounded by the nimbus borrowed from the Persian cult of the sun god. But when all was said and done, the emperor exercised his sway as a Christian ruler. The protection of the Church, the means to salvation for his subjects, was the heart of his responsibilities, and those responsibilities were discharged so effectively and for so long that to this day the Orthodox communion remains strongly entrenched over a huge area of Eastern Europe. In the modern liturgy of the Greek Church, there's still reflected something of that age when the calendar of the Christian year was the calendar of the imperial court. Together they set the rhythms of the immense spectacle which displayed the majesty of the empire, as well as of God, to its own people and to those who came from other countries to wonder at it. Because the religious and secular worlds seemed completely to interpenetrate one another, the art before men's eyes was overwhelmingly religious. For 1,000 years it unceasingly set forth its timeless themes, the greatness and omnipresence of God, the divine authorization of the political system which produced it. It was a remarkable feat of public relations on an international and millennial scale. And when the empire itself passed away, its civilization, its ideas and its style did not. They were passed to other peoples, and so they survived. Perhaps that was the greatest achievement of Byzantium. North of Constantinople lay an alien hinterland, peopled by primitive tribes. The Greeks called them by a name which has come down to us as Slavs. Their origins are obscure, but from the plains of Russia and Eastern Europe, they began to move in the 5th century into what's now Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Greece, Bulgaria. They were harried by conqueror after conqueror, but tenacious agriculturalists and good survivors, the Slavs hung on to the lands they settled. As a result, Eastern Europe today is still largely Slav. In 865, just over half a century after Charlemagne was crowned emperor in Rome, a Bulgarian prince was converted to Christianity, and that seems to me to be the seminal event of Slav history. The conversion of Khan Boris to Orthodoxy was not just a great diplomatic stroke for Byzantium. It tied a developing Slav culture to the Eastern Church. This is Cyril and Methodius Day in Sofia, capital of the atheist Republic of Bulgaria. It's an annual demonstration of the debt Slav Europe owes to its conversion to Orthodoxy. St. Cyril and St. Methodius were brothers, Orthodox missionaries who've gone down in history as the apostles to the Slavs. They were also cultural engineers. They made Slav culture literate. Cyril invented Glagolitic, a script in which the Slav languages could at last be written down. It was the root of another script based on Greek characters and named Cyrillic in his honor, and that is the origin of the alphabets used in Russia and Bulgaria to this day. It was an invention with huge implications, and they started to unroll when Boris decided to use the new written Slavonic at his court, Preslav. The coming of writing and literacy is always a profound change. Writing means better records. It means a new definition of the things that can be done or ought to be done. Literacy is selective, too. It shuts off some influences and lets in others. For centuries, for the Slav peoples, literacy meant that their great men of learning, their statesmen, their lawyers, would look for models to the Eastern Rome, not to the Latin heritage of the Catholic West, but to the Greek heritage of Orthodox Byzantium.
Благоденственное мирное житие, здравие же и спасение, и во всем благое поспешение, подашь Господь.
The civilization of that heritage moved more and more to its own rhythms, out of phase with what was happening in Western Europe.
Болгарскому народу и сохрани его на многое лето.
Orthodox Christendom was to have no Renaissance, no Reformation, no Counter-Reformation. The experiences it has not shared with Western Christendom make a long list. It's not, of course, the whole story of the differences between Slav and Western Europe. It's not even the story of all the Slav peoples, as Catholic Poland and Bohemia show to this day. But it was of supreme importance as the Orthodox faith was carried further and further into the Slav lands, as the Greek missionaries pushed out beyond the Balkans to the plains and the forests of the north and the east. It was there in the Ukraine, a few hundred miles north of the Black Sea, that another enormously important conversion took place toward the end of the 10th century. It was in a little trading principality called Kiev, Kiev Rus. With that name, the idea of Russia enters history. Slavs had originally settled this area and much of the rest of western Russia, hacking out areas of forest, mastering the extremes of the climate, and forming little communities, often on the banks of the rivers which were to prove natural trade routes. Later, down the rivers from the north, came boats carrying marauding Norsemen. Some passed on, some settled among the Slavs, often coming to lord it over them. So appeared the first political units of Russian history, little communities of traders, which were to grow into city-states. About 75 years before the Battle of Hastings, no one knows exactly when, there emerged as a prince in Kiev the man Russians now remember as St. Vladimir. Vladimir wanted power, and religion could help him. Until recent times, Christian conversion was from the top downwards. You won over kings, princes, men of war, and the rest followed. Vladimir shopped around. Russians treasure the story that he rejected Islam because it forbids alcohol. Drinking is the joy of the Rus. We cannot exist without it, he is supposed to have said. Ambassadors sent to inquire elsewhere reported that the Germans had nothing to offer, and that the Bulgars gave off a dreadful stench. Constantinople, though, won their hearts. We knew not whether we were in heaven or earth, they said of St. Sophia. On earth there is no such vision nor beauty, and we are at a loss to describe it. We know only that there God dwells among men. And so, a future Russia was won for Orthodox Christianity. And as a result, even in a Marxist state, Russians still have an Orthodox Church today. Vladimir had made a choice of civilizations. It was the climax of the most splendid and long-drawn-out public relations exercise in history, as well as of careful political calculation on both sides. There followed the conversion of Vladimir's subjects, and that meant, too, their eventual civilization. More than any other single decision, Vladimir's shaped Russia's later history. He settled she should be Christian, and by not making her Catholic, he was contributing another element to a modern enigma. Is Russia a part of the West? But the making of Russia was still to come, and it took centuries. Geography alone would have settled that. The little medieval statelets from which she grew were islands in a vast, ill-defined wilderness of lakes and forests, plains empty of people. Those statelets were born into exposure and isolation in huge spaces where borders could only slowly be defined, often by war that threw up legends and heroes. One hero gave a great Soviet film director, Eisenstein, a theme for a masterpiece, a film about the days when the states of medieval Russia faced the formidable Mongol hordes from the east. The Russian princes stood between these conquerors and Catholic Europe, paying the Mongols the price of tribute. But one 13th century prince turned it to advantage, and so became a hero to later Russians. Alexander Nevsky, Prince of Novgorod.
Князь здешний, Александр. Невский твою пропись. Ага.
Nevsky collaborated with the Mongols so as to be free to face the still more dangerous threat which he saw in the West, from Catholic Germanic Europe. Christian the West might be, but that did not mean it respected the Orthodox Slavs. One pope launched a crusade eastward to push the border of Catholicism out from Sweden, Finland, Germany, into the Slav lands. Settlers and missionaries followed the march. In front were the soldiers, led by the Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights were the cutting edge of the drive to the east. Awesome warriors of a crusading order, soldier monks. To the Slavs, they were doubly hateful. They were both cruel and ferocious enemies, and they were Christians who used the advantage of the Mongols in the Slavs' rear. They were the enemy Nevsky decided to confront. The climax of Eisenstein's film was Nevsky's great victory in 1242 over the Teutonic Knights in a battle on a frozen lake on the borders of Estonia. He was hinting that a repeat performance might be needed soon from his fellow countrymen. And, indeed, within 2 or 3 years of the film's completion, Hitler had launched his drive to the east. What's more, when Eisenstein made his film, there were new Mongols to complete the parallel. Soviet forces were at that moment facing the Japanese in Mongolia. And, of course, Russians still fear the threat of a resurgent China and a reunited Germany. From the days of Alexander Nevsky right down to our own, the borders of Russia in the west were drawn and redrawn by soldiers, by armies. Take this medieval castle, for instance. It was once the front line between militant Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Now it's well inside Finland. Yet Finland itself was for a long time, from the 18th to the 20th centuries, a part of Russia. And further south, much of what we now think of as Russia was once under Catholic power. Smolensk, Kiev, the Ukraine were all part of a great medieval Polish-Lithuanian kingdom. No wonder then that it should be hard to say in what sense Russia really is a part of Europe. No wonder either that those centuries of struggle over frontiers engendered in Russians a distrust, still alive today, of the West. After all, for centuries, her rulers had to live with a nightmare, the recurring possibility that Russia might have to face invasion from the East and from the West simultaneously, from pagan Asia and from Catholic Europe. Nevsky's success showed the plain dwellers that their empty spaces could be defended, and for defense, they looked to princes. To their military power, those princes added the special authority given to rulers by Orthodox teaching. So both the pressure of external enemies and the autocratic Byzantine tradition pushed medieval Russia towards centralization and state power. After Nevsky's epic victory, Novgorod did more than simply survive. The city-state became permanent, stable, and yet it was to lose the leadership of the Russian principalities over the next 2 centuries to another state, Muscovy. But that was only after another huge change, the fall of Byzantium. After the sack of Constantinople by Christian crusaders from the west in 1204, the empire had never really recovered. Early losses of territory continued until, by the 15th century, the imperial city itself, girdled by these walls, was almost all that was left of the former splendor. The long struggle against Islamic and Western predators had been too much. And in 1453, an army of Ottoman Turks delivered the death blow. The 80th and last of Byzantium's emperors died with his soldiers facing the attack. The conqueror set up his throne and said his prayers in St. Sophia, and the great church became a mosque. So the Second Rome became the capital of a new Muslim empire. The Christian world was stunned. Islam had wiped out 1,000 years of Christian history. The Roman Empire was dead at last, and the direct line of descent from classical Mediterranean civilization was snapped. Just as Islam was about to be cleared finally from Spain, its conquests were again unfolding in Eastern Europe, something which was to confuse even more the boundaries of civilizations in the East. The Ottoman Turks were particularly fervent Muslims, perhaps because they had long been a poor border people from Inner Asia, sandwiched between Christendom and the pagan Mongols. But they seized the opportunities provided by the crumbling of rich empires and built their own imperial system when they settled down. In Byzantium's place, the Ottoman sultans created an Islamic civilization ruled from Istanbul. Like its predecessor and victim, the Ottoman Empire was to have a long life and a slow decline. Its final collapse came only within the memory of people still alive today. For a long time, that empire was seen as a menace to Christendom. The Ottomans were, in fact, the last non-Europeans to put Europe on the defensive until this century. Their military machine was headed by the fanatically brave Janissaries. Europe long flinched at the sound of their drums and the war cries which proclaimed that Allah was great and Muhammad was his prophet. Led by the Janissaries, Ottoman armies went on to enjoy another couple of centuries of conquest after their capture of Constantinople. Those conquests gave them not only most of the islands of the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, it also took them deep into mainland Europe. They gained control of Greece, the Balkans, overran Hungary and Ukraine, and reached as far as the borders of Poland and Russia. Twice they were at the gates of Vienna. So, once again, history cut off much of Eastern Europe from the West. It was now ruled by an Islamic military power. 1683 is a good symbolic date for the high watermark of Ottoman success. In that year, the Turks were for the second time besieging Vienna. And if the city fell, Europe seemed undefended. It didn't, and the Turks were routed, abandoning tents, baggage, camels' treasure, as well as 10,000 dead. They would never get so far again.
That was the real end of 1,000 years of Islamic pressure on Europe. For another 2 centuries, the Ottoman Empire would roll back until it finally crumbled away at the end of the Great War. And that meant that for a long time, the Sultan of Turkey ruled a great many Europeans and great tracts of Europe. And that's the reason why many people thought that Asia began over there, just beyond Vienna. It was a different zone of civilization. To begin with, many of its inhabitants were Muslim. They still are today, and only a few years ago, you could see the veil and fez in many parts of Yugoslavia. And then there was Ottoman government. Western Europeans often thought that the Sultan was the very epitome of despotism. They couldn't see in Turkey any of the civil liberties or privileges that they took for granted in Western Europe. Turkish government could be cruel and harsh, too. Impalement was a very nasty form of punishment, and it was commonly practiced by the Turks in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. And about that time, you could have bought a Serbian girl as a concubine in the slave markets of Belgrade. Perhaps Eastern Europe never could have been quite like Western.
300 years of alien rule were bound to deepen existing differences. Much of the region is mountainous and isolated. The languages of its peoples are unlike the Latin and Teutonic tongues of the West. And, of course, the Turks' Christian subjects were not Roman Catholics, but Orthodox believers. The Ottomans were not intolerant, and Christians, like Jews, were allowed to practice their religion, though sometimes their churches were built in an anonymous style which concealed their function. But Christians could no longer look for protection in hard times to a ruler in Constantinople, neither could they look to Rome. So they looked elsewhere, to a church with which they shared doctrine, liturgy, language, the new focus of orthodoxy, Moscow. Muscovy was already the leading Russian state when Constantinople fell to the Turks. Not long after that, a Russian monk wrote to the Tsar in the Moscow Kremlin in words which still sound strange to Western ears. 2 Romes have fallen, the 3rd stands, and a 4th there shall not be. Thou art Christian sovereign of the world, the Lord of all faithful Christians. So, Moscow was to be the 3rd Rome. The fall of the Byzantine Empire offered her a world historical role as protector and patron of orthodoxy just when she was emerging at last as the core of a national state. From the Kremlin, the real founder of the Russian state ruled lands which by the end of his reign stretched to the Urals. That was Ivan the Great, who came to the throne in 1462. He was the first ruler of Russia to be called Tsar, a word which echoes the imperial Caesar. And it was he who adopted the Byzantine double-headed eagle as the insignia of Russian royalty. In one respect, the Russian monarchy never changed after Ivan. Right down to its disappearance in 1917, it was an autocracy, a monarchy in the Byzantine style, its ruler enjoying God-given power to be the sole author of policy, the guardian of Christian religion. From a Western point of view, as the centuries went by, the autocracy became more and more a byword for Asiatic despotism, where none of the legal limits to Western monarchy existed. None of Russia's rulers made more memorable use of that autocratic power than Peter the Great, and the way he used it added one more layer to the Russian enigma, because he turned westward for models to help modernize his country. The Russia into which Peter was born in 1672 was still backward and isolated. Only a few years before, a French king had been able to write to a Tsar, not knowing that the prince he addressed was 10 years dead. Moscow was still a backward, barbaric medieval city. The foreign merchants there were made to live apart in a so-called German quarter. Here the young Peter first came across the foreign knowledge which was so to fascinate him. He met Dutch merchants. He learnt Dutch. In his youth, the Dutch Republic was a world power, its wealth and empire based on maritime commerce and naval strength. Peter was determined to go to Western Europe, and in particular to the Netherlands. The Tsar and autocrat of all the Russias set out with the firm intention not to be treated as a great ruler. He wanted to learn. Russians have long taken two views, broadly speaking, of Peter the Great. Some have seen him as the great perverter, the man who wrenched Russian history by brute force from its predestined course and put it on the wrong road. And the others who've seen him as a great pioneer, a modernizing ruler, a man who put Russia's history on the right course, directing it along the road of the model set by the West. Peter came to Western Europe in 1697, came to Holland, and for a while, briefly, he lived in this little cabin in the village of Zondam. He was traveling incognito, but that can't have meant very much because he was well over 6 foot tall and stood head and shoulders over all his entourage. He must have banged his head on this lintel many times, too. He came to Holland because he was fascinated by ships and shipbuilding, and he came here to work in the dockyards, to learn, as he put it, all that a good ship's carpenter needs to know. Ever since his youth, he'd been fascinated by the idea that in Western Europe were somehow the keys to power, keys that lay in the technologies, skills, sciences, learning, mathematics of the Western societies. And he wanted those keys to power for Russia, to enable her to play her proper part in Europe and to bring her out of her backwardness. He may have been almost the only Russian of his day who thought in terms of modernizing her by turning to and learning from the West. And when Peter went back to Russia, autocracy was put to service in the cause of modernization, which meant westernization. The boyars, the nobility, did not like his reforms, but they obeyed God-given authority. If that meant having their beards cut to symbolize a break with tradition, so be it. If they had to give up their traditional dress at court, they obeyed. The autocrat had spoken. And Peter made Russian nobility something Western nobilities never were, an instrument of autocracy by linking rank to service, not to birth. Peter left his mark in many other ways. He founded the first non-ecclesiastical educational establishment in Russia. He set up an Academy of Sciences, and he built an army which made Russia the greatest power in Eastern Europe. But the most visible symbol of his westernizing mission was built on land conquered from Sweden, St. Petersburg. This was to be Russia's new capital. St. Petersburg was the creation of an act of will, built with appalling hardships by 150,000 men under the direction of French and Italian architects. It was a window on the West, a deliberate rejection of Muscovy and its backward-looking traditions. It summoned Russians to a Western destiny. For 200 years Russia would be ruled from St. Petersburg. Only in 1918 was government to move back to the isolation of Moscow. But how far could the modernizing zeal, even of a Peter, penetrate the vast, stubborn heartland of Mother Russia, the Russia of primitive agriculture and millions of illiterate serfs? 19th century Russia was always too vast and backward-looking to respond quickly to ideas of reform of any kind, engulfed, so it seemed, forever by its mysterious religion and the poverty and ignorance of its people. Some intellectuals, labeled Westernizers, thought the country should turn away from the old Russian ways towards Western Europe. Others, known as Slavophiles, looked to Russian history, Russian soil, Russian religion for a guide and as a destiny. As Tsarist power rolled east into Asia, Russia became less Russian, less Western. But, Dostoevsky wrote, in Europe we were Asiatics, whereas in Asia we too are Europeans. The Tsar was Tsar of all the Russias. The autocracy was the binding tie, as pervasive as geography, climate and religion, and the only source of change. For what change there was came always from above, from the autocrat. There were no other sources of initiative, no obstreperous noblemen, fiercely independent cities, cantankerous parliaments, as in Western Europe. Only the Tsar could have ordered the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, the basis of the Russian economy and of Russian government. When the effects of emancipation began to be felt at last in the 1890s and early years of the century, Russia began to show startlingly fast economic growth. But industrialization brought new problems, which the autocracy could not handle. To the hunger of the peasant population was added the grievance of a small but growing industrial proletariat. Russia was vulnerable to seductive new ideas from Western Europe, like Marxism. For all that, in 1914, Russia was a great military power. So much so that the German General Staff were anxious to engage her forces while they felt they could still beat them. And the war began, which was to shatter the autocracy and detonate the revolution of 1917, which Russia's current historical mythology treats as the dawn of a new age. But history can be seen in more than one way, and Russians are suspicious of outsiders who pronounce on theirs. Certainly, there were startling changes. The double-headed eagle passed from history. Clearly, a great event had taken place. An empire had fallen to pieces. The greatest Eastern power was out of action. No one knew for how long. A new regime had emerged. Bolshevik Russia, with a new Western ideology. Marxist communism, atheist and materialist, fiercely opposed to the old religious Russia. That was, indeed, a huge change, heralding a new era of world politics, but some things had not changed. Russia, after all, did not emerge from despotism to democracy and freedom. She moved from one autocracy to another. And the new autocracy, like the old, used its power for its own purposes. Force and terror were mobilized towards new goals: centralization, collectivization, further industrialization, modernization for strength. The Moscow, which had been the third Rome, had been a great subversive power, the focus of the hopes of the oppressed Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Now there was a fourth Rome, a Moscow to which those of all nations who felt themselves oppressed could turn for encouragement, inspiration, aid. The resources and energies of the new superstate were to be put behind a crusade, a reincarnation of the old messianic pretensions of Tsarist Russia. But this time, the faith that was to be sent forth to the four corners of the earth was not Orthodox Christianity, but Marxist revolution. So much from the past survived. Since 1917, Russia's earlier history has not ceased to mold Russian behavior, Russian personality, and Russian attitudes to the rest of the world. Nor has it ceased to affect the way other countries perceive her. In my view, the importation of Western Marxism is only one of the last, and by no means the most important, of those historical facts which still make it difficult to decide whether Russia is part of or is alien to Western Europe. So the Russian border isn't a good answer to the question, where does Europe end in the East? Marxism, after all, was only the last layer in 1,000 years of interplay between Russia and the rest of Europe. Russia may feel uneasy and suspicious when she looks westwards, but to Asians and Africans, or at least to many of them, she often seems just another rich, advanced, progressive Western power, even if she has quarreled with other members of the group. And sometimes she looks like a rich, advanced, progressive Western imperialist, too. And what about the other frontier that runs south from here in Finland and cuts Europe in two, looping around half Germany and running southeast as far as the Black Sea, the frontier of the Cold War? Well, that's politically significant, but it doesn't divide two civilizations. On both sides of that line, there are countries linked by blood, by language, by religion, by culture. 1,000 years of history were not swept away by the fact of where the Red Army got to in 1945. European civilization spans the barbed wire, and it spans it because it lives in the minds of men. To understand those minds, you have to explore their history. You have to consider migration and settlement, the work of men like Vladimir and Justinian, the legacy of the Byzantine Empire, and the legacy of Ottoman rule in Europe, and much, much else besides. The question, where does Europe end in the East, is not going to go away.